I'm Ceinwen Jones. I was at the Temple of Peace from 1975 to 1977 after my work abroad. And I was the assistant officer for CWC Cymru, that's the Council for Education and World Citizenship Cymru, which is the schools arm of the Welsh Centre for International Affairs. I was a volunteer teacher in Madagascar with the United Nations Association International Service.
I'm Dr. John Copley. I joined the Welsh Centre for International Affairs in 1972, stayed with them 6 years, the first 3 years as Assistant Secretary of CUC, and then I became the first Assistant Director of the Centre. I joined having just done my first Masters, so straight from university. I regarded CUC as basically seeking to increase awareness, spread knowledge of international affairs, international development, trying to create a kind of internationalism amongst young people, because obviously we worked mainly in schools and colleges, and I think the idea was that clearly to develop a real internationalism among people, you have to start young. And it was fascinating work. I think both Ceinwen and I really felt we were out to change the world. It's the 70s, there are obviously lots of developments taking place. What I find fascinating so many years afterwards is that so many issues that attract so much attention today, we were dealing with those same issues 40 years ago.
And more, yes.
Yep.
Things like the environment. I mean, it was very much an issue then. I think it's much more of an issue now. The Middle East, well, you think about all the changes that have happened, but it's still a huge issue. I suppose about the only thing that I can think of that we discussed then at great length, but is perhaps not so much of an issue now, was apartheid in South Africa. But the world was still coming through the period after the 1968 revolutions, or the risings, or whatever you call them, in Europe. And I think it was a time of change. So many things were changing at that time, but perhaps not enough.
And why did you both want to be part of that? What was it about the two of you?
Well,
It was just a job that greatly appealed to me. I would regard myself as having a developing political consciousness. My academic study was politics, but I always regarded that an international approach was needed. International cooperation was essential for the world to develop the way one wanted to, and clearly therefore this job provided a means by which one could put one's ideals into operation. And also I think the idea of clearly working with young people was very interesting, because in many ways they were very receptive, but one clearly has to appreciate in the 70s it's different obviously from attitudes today. The whole basis of knowledge, there was no internet then, and therefore, say when we went out to schools, often the things we spoke about, for some of the pupils, and certainly in parts of Wales, and I mean no disrespect to certain parts of Wales, it really perhaps was the first time such issues had been raised with them. And we were clearly dependent in the school's work, obviously again on some enlightened teachers who wanted to bring us in to work with their students.
Well, one of the things that we did was to go out and speak, give lectures or discussions in schools. Another was sixth form conferences. We had one big sixth form conference every year, and there were debates and so on as well. There was even an apprentices conference, I remember, that we organised. We sent out information through from the office out to the schools, wherever possible bilingually, but I don't think it would stand up to the standards today because we didn't have the resources. We also had a curriculum development project, which I think John started on and I carried on the work of developing. And there again, we were very dependent on teachers who were enlightened and who were really enthusiastic, who were able to implement some of these curriculum development ideas. It was a time before the national curriculum, of course, and some of the schools were very receptive.
Yeah. I think one has to, again, following on from that, the sources of finance, again, in the early 70s, I know every kind of voluntary organisation will claim that they have problems, but literally we were very under-resourced, both in the office, for the Welsh Centre itself, and therefore often it was doing what we could with very limited resources.
We only had 5 people working in the Welsh Centre for International Affairs in those years. We had the director.
Across all the different
Yes,
Oh, really?
yes. That was for the United Nations Association, CUC Cymru for the schools, and Freedom from Hunger campaign. So we had the director, we had 2 secretaries, a part-time finance person. Oh, I can't count, obviously. That's 6 people, and then John and myself.
So you were both here when Bill Davis was
Yes,
there?
yes.
And I think one needs to pay credit to Bill. Bill was instrumental in the establishment of the Welsh Centre for International Affairs. He put in an awful lot of work, and I think without him it probably wouldn't have taken place.
We're looking at what your impressions were of the Temple of Peace and how significant it was for the 2 of you to do your work from such a building.
Yeah.
Did that matter to you? Or?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, the whole idea of peace in particular, the health bit was a bit separate from us, but the whole idea of the Temple of Peace for us was that it was a focus for peace in international relations. And as I'd just come back from abroad, I was extremely keen on development studies to increase understanding of development throughout the world and how that could be helped by the first world, as they called it in those days, because in those days we talked about first world and third world, didn't we? Which, of course, nowadays you don't. But I think it was incredibly important. Yes.
What were your first impressions of the temple? What did you know about it? Like the whole idea?
I knew very little, although I'd done my first degree in Cardiff. I'd then gone to Sheffield to do my first master's, and literally a job came up, and
How did you hear about the job? Who told you about it?
basically just through the newspaper. But I had just got married, and my wife had just started a career in the media down here, so I gravitated down here when the job came up.
And you've never gone back?
Never gone back. Indeed, it's I can't say Wales has gained and Yorkshire's lost, but I think again what one needs to accept is that normally the CUC officer just held post for a year, because that's really all the money allowed for. So my holding it for 3 years and then Ceinwen holding it for 2 was really quite significant. But what it clearly gave for us was a degree of continuity, instead of the person coming in, having to get to know the job, having to get to know the contacts. There was a little bit more of a foundation that we could work upon.
And the fact that I came in and followed you meant that you could always help me out if necessary, because you by that time were a UNA officer for the United Nations Association, and you had to look after branches.
We had the exchange program developing, and again I think here we need to pay tribute to a gentleman called John Burford, who unfortunately has passed away a number of years ago. John was a community worker, but had a very strong interest in the international exchange program, and likewise with Robert Davis. one needs to pay tribute to Robert.
Because it's because of Robert that. Say a little bit about the peace, what do you know?
Well, it was after our time.
No. Certainly during our years, the exchange program expanded, and I would say probably took off during those years. Clearly, when you then had a designated officer to deal with it, there was a chance that clearly for it to grow much more. I had to deal with it in a range of other duties, but it certainly was, very interesting, and again, one has to put it in the early 70s. And obviously again, international travel, international exchange then were much more limited than they are these days.
And people came from all over Europe, all over...
That's
Did
right.
you have any from further afield than Europe? I can't remember.
No, it tended mainly to be Europe because obviously they had to finance themselves. There were kind of sister organisations in a whole range of countries that we liaised with and worked with. And I remember John Burford and myself once in John's Skoda. And Skodas then were not quite the quality that they are these days. And we drove to a conference in Germany. How we got there and how we managed to get back, I don't know. But again, it was in its infancy, but developing.
It was mainly work camps in Wales, wasn't it?
Yes.
If I remember rightly,
Yeah,
yes.
that's
yes.
right. In a whole range of projects. Clearly we were dependent then on kind of sponsors for the particular projects who would put the volunteers up, provide them obviously with food and things, and meaningful work tasks to do, because clearly if it wasn't a meaningful task, the volunteers themselves wouldn't appreciate it. And likewise we then extended a programme of trying to send volunteers from Wales clearly to camps overseas.
And for you, kind of, then, just talking about the building, do you have first impressions of the building, what it was like, whether it contributed to the work? Have you got funny stories about the building?
Well, I just remember that we had, John and I shared an office, and John was not the tidiest of people, but neither was I. So it was, and of course there were no computers in those days. So everything had to be done either by hand, or we had to wait for the two secretaries to find time to type the letters. So that's why you'll find probably in the archives there are lots of files full of handwriting from that era. But the building itself, well, I think we were fairly cramped even then, but the council chamber was always really impressive. And the hall, I remember seeing the hall for the first time and thinking, wow, that was magnificent. I do remember that I think you had to arrange a fair there one Christmas, or yes, it must have been just before Christmas. And I remember there was a jazz band that you'd organised, and it turned up. Unfortunately, it started to snow very heavily, and nobody else turned up.
You and the jazz.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, but no, they
Do you have
were.
favourite parts of the building? And did you go down to the crypt?
I did go down to the crypt, but I wasn't terribly impressed in those days. I'm more impressed now when I think back, But,
Yeah, we if we had, shall we say, distinguished visitors, clearly the crypt was one of the places that we would take them round, and then also. But what was very, very important is that we were a Welsh centre, and we were very conscious that we covered the whole of Wales so far as we could. So one might, if one was speaking at a school, say in Mid Wales, North Wales, you'd try to arrange, say, a week's series
That's right,
of visits.
yes. Yeah.
Likewise, occasionally with distinguished speakers, one would take them on a kind of speaking tour, and you might be away for a week at a time. But that was very, very important. And
Got examples of distinguished speakers?
I don't know whether you want to edit this. Jeremy Thorpe
handle things. Just being
Yes.
honest.
No, I once spent a week taking Jeremy Thorpe around in my wife's orange Mini. There was another gentleman, his name probably won't mean much, called Jim McKinnon, but he was quite a significant environmentalist at the time. Again, what this did was because local authorities, certainly for the school's work, would be affiliated to CUBE and to the Welsh Centre, and clearly it was very important that we put in appearances and try to involve them in our work, and one way to do that was to take a speaker round to them.
We also, of course, had a lot of distinguished speakers to our conferences.
Yeah,
both
absolutely.
the UNA conferences
Yeah.
and the schools conferences.
And these were conferences held at the Temple.
No, they were, well, some of them were. So I remember there was a conference for local authorities held in the Temple of Peace. But generally speaking, the sixth form conferences and the apprentices conferences were residential.
Yeah.
So we had to go somewhere where there was
Sometimes
accommodation.
Gruggunnog, Coleg, various places.
Yes.
And there was, Ceinwen mentioned obviously the National Sixth Form Conference. There was also a Welsh Medium National Sixth Form Conference. And again there, we were obviously we sought to involve academics, and
politicians.
politicians.
I remember Anne Clwyd coming to
Yeah.
speak when she was quite young, obviously. I'm just trying to think of other speakers that we had.
Yeah,
They're quite famous people at the time.
quite a lot, yeah.
Yes.
And
And you were saying that in your normal day-to-day work it was quite challenging because you didn't have the internet, you didn't have... so you talked a little bit about the challenges. What were some of the things that you're most proud of, if you remember, that you...
I think probably the curriculum development project was something that I was most proud of, in the sense that we felt that we were really getting to grips with something more long-lasting. It wasn't just a one-off. With the sixth form conferences, you felt that you did have an impact on those sixth formers. Very definitely, I think, because people came up to us afterwards and said, "Oh, we were really impressed with that." But with the curriculum development project and trying to get that as part of a curriculum in a school throughout Wales, you felt that perhaps there was an opportunity there for longer lasting impressions on more people.
Well, what has struck me is that probably on about half a dozen occasions, 40 years afterwards, I've been attending a function, doing something, and somebody has come up to me and said, "You don't remember me, do you? I attended such and such a conference, with a CUBE conference," and that for me, is very significant. That it did undoubtedly have an impact. A range of issues, to be quite honest. What we introduced, because they'd normally be about 5 days.
Yes, they would be.
We introduced simulation exercises.
I was going to,
And well, I wrote a number of simulation exercises, such on the Middle East, Southern Africa, the world oil situation, where you would have these students. They were all given briefs, and they would represent the different participants. Say, in the case of the Middle East, the various factions, the various countries. We would present them with a scenario, and they would seek to react, taking the role of their particular country. And we often found that extremely useful. I remember having done one on the Middle East. I mentioned this to Ceinwen the other day. As with the Middle East, you've got to have, should we say, some people representing, should we say, armed forces, not of a state kind. Some would call them terrorists, some would call them freedom fighters. And I remember there was once an editorial in the Western Mail following one of these exercises, and basically saying I was teaching young people to be terrorists. because some of them had taken that role. And what greatly impressed me was about 3 or 4 of the students wrote in to the paper saying, that's a load of rubbish. What it did was to extend our understanding, to give us a kind of feeling, to put us in the place of various participants in a very unresolvable situation. And in many ways, some of the kind of issues, again, we were dealing with 40 years ago are still
with us.
there with us in the world today. Because one of the big issues that we dealt with was kind of issues of growing world population
and poverty.
Poverty.
Which is still an issue, of course.
Yeah. So where we could use material, but clearly, as Ceinwen has intimated, so much of it we had to write ourselves.
I actually set up a little office in the vestibule by the main hallway in the Temple of Peace, which I used for storing the leaflets and information that we'd produced in order to make it easier to send it out to schools, because we had so little space.
and then obviously, and that clearly this again Ceinwen alluded to, when I became assistant director, I had then responsibility for the unibranches. Again, one has to put it in the time context. There were some very, very devoted people. But as it is today, the United Nations is often judged by various means that perhaps don't fully appreciate the constraints that it works under, the difficulties that it works under. But there we were clearly dealing more with older people. There was a number of unibranches in Wales. One has to say, not a massive number, but one would spend time working with them, and again the kind of volunteers, certainly say with the work camps, the unibranch members would often volunteer and help with the work camps. Likewise, at that time, the Welsh Centre was the home for the Freedom from Hunger campaign, or what remained of it.
But it was actually UK-wide, but run from the Welsh Centre for International Affairs.
That's right. Yeah.
I think we have to pay tribute to teachers as well, the teachers who were so
Like
supportive.
You wouldn't have been able to do unless
No,
you
that's
had-
right.
No,
That's right.
because
Yes,
clearly we were dependent on being invited into
That's
a
right.
school,
yes.
and there were various
And they were schools
teachers'
all
committees.
over Wales,
All
they
over
were
Wales.
very
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
diverse.
Very diverse.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Those
There
speaking
was-
Welsh, those speaking
Yeah.
English as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was a very good CUTE committee around Newtown and Mid Wales, and some very, very devoted teachers there. So one would work with them a great deal.
There was also the goodwill message from the young people of Wales to the world, which was at that time run by CUTE.
Yeah.
We were instrumental in setting it up, so we would ask a school or a collection of schools to produce a goodwill message, and then eventually it got transferred to Urdd Gobaith Cymru. Well, the pupils would set up the messages for
Yeah.
peace and goodwill to other nations, and the theme would vary.
And this still goes on now.
This still goes on now, yes. Yes.
So how will you both, because it's the 80th anniversary of the Temple of Peace, how will you remember your time at the significant wow moment, and whether it made a difference to you that you were housed here in this building?
If I can be personal, when I joined the Welsh Centre, there's this young, idealistic, bearded, long-haired young man. I honestly thought, I'm here for life. I honestly did in the beginning, but things didn't quite work out that way. But for me, certainly, the first 6 years of my working life, it was an an amazing experience. It literally was. And one feels very privileged to have been able to do the work that we were doing then. I think there's clearly an element of regret in that the issues that we spent so much time on then are still, really all of them, still very live, enormous problems today. But without it, without the work obviously that's presently being done and by a whole host of clearly other organisations, and I think one has to accept at that time there were far fewer voluntary organisations, NGOs working in the area that we were. Things will clearly be even worse, but one hopes that the work has to continue.
Well, do you feel like the piece still has significance today?
Well, most definitely. I mean, I think that we then felt that we were pioneering quite a lot of the work going into schools in particular, which was so important in increasing understanding. Nowadays, the work is very much easier in some respects, but very much more difficult because of the many and varied problems in the world, but it's still absolutely vital. I think we really need to increase international understanding at a time when we can interchange information on a global scale, something that wasn't possible in those days, and yet do we really have greater understanding of how other people live or what their problems are? I wonder, and I think therefore it's absolutely vital that this work carries on, that the work of developing understanding of how other people are, how they live, what their problems are, how we can live together peacefully. Absolutely vital. But it was a really exciting time.
And why did you take the job here? Because you wanted to change the world?
Yes, I was.
Why did you want to change the world?
Well, because I'd lived abroad, I understood some of the issues that I'd seen firsthand in a very poor country. Madagascar is still about the 6th poorest country in the world, and has increasing problems, it appears. And I'd seen some of those problems. I wanted people to understand that these people wanted to improve their lives. They wanted to develop. They wanted to have a better life for their children. And that that the whole issue of international development was not just a question of aid, that it's a question of trade and international cooperation. And that was the message that I wanted to get across.
And you were both here during the era of CND and anti-apartheid. Is there anything you'd like to say about changes you saw?
I think with CND, we obviously may have had our personal affiliations. The work of CND as such, I don't think figured very much certainly in my work. Clearly the issue of spending on arms. I remember it was an apprentices conference up in North Wales, and there were quite a number of apprentices from the kind of aerospace industry, and I remember standing up saying, I basically want to get rid of your jobs because I want the money to go to other things, and it, shall we say, brought forward quite a healthy debate. I remember certainly on the kind of simulation exercise on Southern Africa, and thinking at the time, would apartheid ever really be abolished? And therefore, the significance of what has happened there is really massively crucial.
Yes. Apartheid was a huge issue for the sixth form conferences, certainly. It always figured, and I think that it opened quite a lot of people's eyes, the fact that we debated the issue. certainly very impressive.
Yeah. I think clearly, as with anybody involved in education, whilst you have your own commitments and your own kind of thoughts, it is very important then, as I think it should be today, that you put forward as balanced a perspective as possible. And I think the approach was, just don't take on board everything that we are saying, question everything we're saying, but the crucial thing is you question. And it's through that the kind of greater understanding that one was seeking, hopefully, might have been developed. But clearly as dealing
with the Middle East.
Absolutely. One has to put forward, that there are differing perspectives.
People still question now, or do you think?
I think, yes, I'm sure that they do still question. Whether they question enough is something. I mean, it's a bit hard to say, isn't it? As I say, we have so much information available at our fingertips these days through the internet. There is also the question of social media, and as you say, that people are reinforced in their own beliefs because they only read the things that they agree with, and that is a real danger. Yes.
And I think again one has to put it in the kind of context. Although we worked at the Welsh Centre in the 70s, that obviously just followed on from the 60s. The beginnings, say, of the spread in higher education of disciplines like sociology and such, which were new kind of academic thinking at the time.
And the risings of 1968, if you can call them risings, the
Yeah.
whole youth revolt of 1968 was not far behind us at that time.
Absolutely.
It was a time of great change and
Do you
turmoil.
think people felt that, and that they could, along with you, change the world?
And I think so, yes. I think
the demonstrations against America in Vietnam, the Grosvenor Square incidents and things like that. Now, I'm not saying that young people of today, aren't aware, but likewise, there's a lot of problems facing young people that perhaps weren't as evident then in various ways. They've obviously got massive more opportunities, but they've also got a lot of problems.
What would you say are the most?
I think getting jobs, getting housing, meeting the demands of the 21st century, which poses, I think, a lot of pressures on young people. Ceinwen's alluded to social media and the whole that. I think that, in one way, clearly is of enormous advantage to young people, but it clearly also, I think, puts a lot of pressure on so many of them.
I think there is a very real danger of people swallowing propaganda from whichever side without questioning sufficiently, and I think that is vitally important, that they have the ability to think, well, is this likely to be true? Is this fake news? Is this something that perhaps we should consider a bit more deeply? And that's really what's important these days, and I'm not sure that everybody is thinking deeply enough about what the consequences can be for certain policies.
Yeah.
What would you like to say to the Temple of Peace on its 80th?
Happy birthday.
I think that the legacy that Wales has in the Temple of Peace is an amazing legacy, dating back to Henry Richard, the Apostle of Peace in the 19th century, going right through the Welsh League of Nations Union and the establishment of the Temple of Peace. I think it's a fantastic legacy for Wales that we shouldn't lose sight of. So happy birthday to the Temple of Peace, and long may it continue to work for peace in the world, for international understanding, international cooperation.
Yeah, I think without the actual building, Wales would have been poorer. Without the work of CUIC, the United Nations Association, the Welsh Centre for International Affairs, and all the associated agencies that presently we know today expand its work, Wales likewise would be poorer.
Yes.
We need work that was done. We need the work that is presently being done. We all need to question more, and I think that's part of its fundamental job, to make us all question. I think it was an iconic building, and given clearly its location in the centre of Cardiff, that likewise I think gave it a special significance.
It's a symbol of peace, and I think that it's a symbol that Wales used to be a peaceful nation, and I think it should be a peaceful nation working for peace in the world.
Do you have a favourite part of the building, or not particularly? Or?
Well, I think the hall. As it happens, my daughter got married here last year.
Really?
In the hall, yes, and the council chamber was used as well. But that was actually coincidental, but it was very symbolic because I also met my husband here. Well, the UNA were organising a conference for local authorities, and this councillor came up and started talking to me. And I remembered him because he made a silly joke. And I didn't meet him again for 3 years. But when I did meet him again, then we got together and we eventually got married. And so the fact that I worked here, that I met my husband here, then my daughter got married here, it means that it's a very significant building for me for other reasons as well.